Welcome to a new episode of TESOL Kuwait podcast. Our special guest today is Dr. Khawla Badwan. Dr. Badwan is a reader in TESOL and Applied Linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her research spans various critical areas, including language and social justice, the sociolinguistics of globalization, language policy, and the materiality of language. Dr. Badwan is dedicated to exploring how language interacts with social issues, particularly in education, and advocates for a critical approach to language education and sustainability. She has authored numerous publications with over 30 research articles and book chapters to her name. Dr. Badwan is also the author of the book Language in a Globalized World. The book expands on the sociolinguistics of globalization approach, which is still taking shape in the field. It also examines the role of English as a global lingua franca and asks how this status impacts our attitudes towards language. So without further ado, let's start our chat with Dr. Khawla Badwan. Dr. Khawla Badwan, thank you again for accepting our invitation to this episode of the podcast, talking about language and language ideologies in classrooms. Could you just provide our listeners with an overview about your research interest in TESOL?
Thank you, Abdul Latif. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to discuss language ideologies and how they impact the language classroom. Language ideologies, I think, is a really important theme in relation to the language classroom. Thinking about my own background, I started in the world of TESOL more than 15 years ago, and my own vision for English language education at the time was very different. So the young language teacher in me used to think that teaching English is all about teaching new words and teaching grammar and following the latest fads in relation to, I don't know, communicative language teaching, task-based learning. This is what language learning meant to me when I started. I did this for a number of years, and then I started to feel really bored. I started to ask myself really questions, big questions such as, is this what language education is about? Is it all about teaching vocabulary and grammar?
Yeah.
I started to feel that there was a really big mismatch between the topics we discussed in the classroom and the lived experiences of most of the students that I was working with. And I felt that this mismatch was very troubling. I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to theorize it. But this is when I was very fortunate to start a master's in applied linguistics. And I have to tell you, Abdul Latif, that was the start of a long journey. And that was the moment when I started learning about language ideologies and how language ideologies influence not only what we do as teachers in the classroom, but also how we judge our learners, how learners think about us, how we think about themselves, and how they think about the world of English language education more broadly. So this is how I started. I started as a puzzled English language teacher who felt really troubled by the limitations of what you can do in the classroom if you narrow your understanding of what language education is about. So that's the start of my story, if you like.
So if you say that it's not only about words and grammar and tasks and teaching methods, so what is it about exactly? What is
Good
language
question.
about?
It took me a few number of years to answer that question.
Yeah.
And very, very briefly, language learning is about creating a world. So language is really important for world making. When you're learning a new language, you're not just developing new words for new things. You're not just learning new grammatical rules that belong to a new language. You're not just trying to imitate people you want to sound like. You're actually making a world. Language is really important for world making.
Yeah.
And, it starts to become really complicated because if you start as a language educator, if you start to see yourself as somebody who's actually creating and making worlds and is involved in that process of worlding with your students, that's when you start to ask yourself, okay, so what's my role in this? And who am I in relation to the ideological construction of my learners? How am I helping them develop new identities
Yeah.
or maintain same identities as they develop this new world.
Yeah.
You know, the minute you start thinking about this, the minute you start to realize that you're not just a language teacher, I like to tell my students that they should stop using the word teacher. They are educators. You're not
Yes.
just a language teacher, you're a language educator.
Yeah. I've
And in
seen this.
terms,
I've seen this tweet and I liked it. Yeah.
absolutely. And sometimes people feel quite intimidated by the word educator. It's a
Mm,
big word. But that big word carries a big responsibility. You know,
exactly.
education is about the practice of attention, as Tim Ingold refers to it. So it's about paying attention to the becoming of individuals, because
Mhm,
education is really important to who we are now, to
mhm.
our becoming, and to the way we see ourselves, the way we see other people, the way we see the world. And
Yes.
English language education lies at the center of that. You know,
Mm,
often students say to me, oh, well, I'm just an English teacher. You know, I teach vocabulary and grammar. We talk about the weather or sports or celebrity life or whatever, you know. And I
mm.
say to them, no, this is just the surface. This is what English language education looks from the surface. Your role
Yeah.
is much more important than that.
Yes, exactly. So, do you think that the way teachers explain language to students like have an effect on them how they perceive how language works?
Yes, this is the short answer. The problem, though, is that often teachers don't think about what language is when they
Mm,
introduce it to learners. So
mm,
English is taken for granted. It's a school subject, for example, just like, I don't know, science or history or math or whatever school subject.
mhm,
And from my experience, I know that very, very few teachers actually take some time to think with
mhm,
their students about some very basic questions, such as what's English?
mm.
Who are you as an English learner? Who do you want to become as an English learner, and why? And I think these are really important starting questions that we need to start with.
Mm. Exactly, yeah. So, as you know, our episode is about language ideologies. So, first, what language ideologies are? What are they, and how can they shape the perception of students about language, about the speaker of the language?
So, language ideologies, in very simple terms, refer to the beliefs that we hold about language. And these beliefs, they don't just influence how we speak, but they also influence how we judge other people. So we
Mhm,
see that these beliefs have at least two functions. They
mhm,
influence how we want to project ourselves through language, but
mhm,
they also influence the judgments we make on other people as we hear them speak.
mhm,
And these ideologies, these beliefs are very influential because the minute somebody starts to open their mouth and speak, you start to make judgments about them.
yes, yeah,
And you start making judgment about their age, their education, where they're from, etc. This is inevitable. You know, this
yeah,
is part of the social psychology of language.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I often, you know, I'm sure your listeners now are probably making all sorts of judgments about me based on the language that I am producing at the moment. You know,
mhm,
that's how humans communicate. I
yeah,
often say to my students about the power of how much people can deduct about you based on the language that you speak. And I use the example of Lady Justice. You know, the figure of
mhm,
Lady Justice is a figure of a blindfolded person. And the
mhm,
idea that that person needs to be blindfolded is
mhm,
because of trying to minimize the impact of race and gender and
mhm.
age on the judgment of
Yeah,
somebody. So, sort of trying to be objective. And I
mhm,
often say to my students, while you are blindfolded, all of these things are things that you can still deduct from language. You could hear somebody and make certain judgments or assumptions about their age, about their race, about where they are from, etc., etc. So this is the power of language ideologies. Not all language ideologies are negative. Not all of them are positive. They are beliefs. Some of them could be neutral, and they influence communication in different ways, as I explained. Now, it's important to think about language ideologies in the context of language learning for different reasons. I could think about two reasons at the moment. So the first one is they are evaluative. And this means that teachers need to be aware of the language ideologies they hold themselves, because this awareness is important for teachers when it comes to understanding how these ideologies are used to evaluate learners, evaluate peers, and evaluate the social world around us. So that's the first, the first powerful function, if you like, is that they are evaluative. And for that reason, it's really important that we make ourselves aware of these evaluations. The second function is that they can be easily reproduced and normalized. So these beliefs that we hold, unless we stop and think and ask ourselves, where do I get these beliefs from? What do they mean for me in practice? They can easily, they're quite sneaky. They can easily become part of the norm. You start thinking, well, this is the normal way of speaking English, British Standard English, American Standard English, I don't know, Australian Standard English, that's normal English. Well, actually, no, this is not normal English. This is something that has been normalized through a process of not interrogating language ideologies. So I'm really pleased that we're discussing language ideologies today, Abdulatif. I think it's a really important topic that's rarely acknowledged in the classroom, mainly because of this normalized ideas that we have around what language is, what proper language is, what standard language is. And the bottom line of all of that is our responses to all of these questions are actually ideological.
Exactly. Yeah. But this is the problem, actually, when it comes from the teacher. The students, they see the teacher as the source of knowledge, regardless of the subject. But since it's a teacher there, then this teacher knows everything about this subject. When we as teachers tell our students that this is the proper way, this is the only proper way to say, for example, this word, or to use this language, they will take it for granted. And whenever they hear something different, they'll say, no, this is incorrect. Why? Because my teacher told me the correct way to say this is that. So yeah, as you said, teachers have a very, very, very imperative role in instilling ideologies in students. But you mentioned positive and negative ideologies. What are the positive, like one example of each?
So ideologies are beliefs, and these beliefs could be positive, could be negative. So, for example, I could hold the belief that language means different things, and that there is nothing called standard English or proper English. Language is a means of communication and being in the world, and that is my belief. Right. Now, I like to think that this is a positive belief. I like to think that I use this belief to develop inclusive pedagogies, to think about language as something pluralistic and diverse that means different things, and it's always in the making. Now, somebody could take this same example and say, well, actually, this is a negative language ideology because it's diluting standards. It ignores the standardized English. It sort of challenges this core thing we call standard English that we need to treasure and look after, etc. So this is the idea. Ideologies are beliefs. And different people can take the same belief into different directions. Exactly. That's why I always try to make clear that, these beliefs could be positive, they could be negative, they could be neutral. And these judgments that we make, positive, negative, neutral, are also subjective judgments, as I said. We might
Yeah.
not disagree on a certain belief as being positive or negative. That's why these judgments or assumptions are also subjective. But I'd like to go back to the point that you mentioned about teachers, when you said teachers have an imperative role to play. I think one of the key problems in TESOL teacher education is that it focuses too much on the professional side of language teaching. So you
Yeah.
spend most of your undergraduate degree looking at the practical things of classroom teaching and classroom management. I don't say we don't need that. This is really important. You need to develop as a professional teacher, but
Yeah.
that's not all what English language teacher education should be about. Unfortunately, not all undergraduate programs, not all teacher education programs include aspects of critical and theoretical language education. And this is why we end up with the situation where we are now, where we have English language teachers who are highly professional, they're very experienced, they know how to develop lesson plans, how to manage classes, how to teach skills, how to assess skills, but they lack the critical dimension of language. They lack an understanding of all of these dimensions, the critical aspects of what else comes with language. And this is a package that comes with language, whether you like it or not. You can't reduce language. So I remember I had this discussion with a student who graduated now, and she said to me, I don't want to engage with any of that. For me, language is skills and functions. And I said to her, that's absolutely fine. But unfortunately, you can't decide what comes
Yeah.
with language into your classroom.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it as a set of skills and functions, that's fine. This is a very functional view of language, but unfortunately, this is not what language is about.
Yeah.
So what I would like to say through this podcast is lots of things need to change when it comes to teacher education at undergraduate level. How do we prepare English language teachers to become more than teachers, to become educators? And the answer to that is you need to add other dimensions to the professional aspect of language teaching. You need a critical dimension. So you end up with teachers who understand what language means and what language does.
Yes, exactly. The reason I mentioned negative and positive is that because you reminded me of an article I read for Caitlin Fine and her colleagues. Uh, they mentioned something about harmful ideologies in the classroom, and they said they act as barriers to language learning. Why? Because of, again, standard language ideology. So if we apply standard language ideology in the classroom, how can this be a barrier, in your opinion?
It can be a barrier in the sense that it reduces language to one thing, and we call it, following the work of Alistair Pennycock and Chris Hall, this is called the monolithic understanding of language. Monolithic understanding is this idea that this massive sociolinguistic system called language is reduced to something very narrow and very neat. Let's call it standard English for now. Now, I am not arguing that we do not need to teach standard English. I believe standard English is really important. And I believe it's not our judgment as educators to decide for our students who they should sound like. This is a personal decision that students need to take for themselves, because as I said, as you're learning a language, you are developing a new identity in that language.
Yes.
The harm here is in trying to reduce the identity options that you as a learner could have.
Yes.
So if I tell you that your only option is to speak in this way, what about those who can't get to that level? What about those who don't want to speak in that particular way? So in a way, you are using in the idea of harmful ideologies here is that these could become stigmatizing labels
Yeah.
that you could use as a teacher yourself because these students are not producing what you expect from them, or they could be stigmatizing, whereby learners start signaling one another out for not speaking in the way that they are expected. So in a way, these harmful ideologies start to become mechanisms for conforming to a one particular identity option. And I believe as educators, we need to describe the different options. It's not our job to make a decision. Standard English will always be something desirable for many learners. And if that's what they want to learn, that's what they want to learn, but it should not be the only identity option that's available to learners. And we also need to remember that it might not be attainable. There are millions of English language learners around the world who have learned English and made it their own. They speak it in their own way, which is, miles away from standard English.
That's
And there
completely
is some,
fine, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, as long as they can use it to communicate, to deliver the message, that's fine. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's say now, can you share like any example or case studies from your research that illustrate the real world impact of language ideologies on language learners?
I could think about a recent example. So I was working in a primary school back in April, so about five months ago. I was working with year 4 children. So this is 7 to 8-year-old. Most of these children are multilingual speakers. They've arrived in Manchester in the United Kingdom within a year or 2 years. And I remember I had a discussion with the children at the beginning about learning English and how they feel as speakers of English. And many of them said quite surprising statements. I remember a child from India who said to me, when I started learning English, I felt that I did not belong. My English was not good enough. I am still learning. I don't think my English is good. And her English was excellent. Her English was not a barrier at all. She was able to take part in all of the activities, and English was not a barrier.
Yeah.
But this is, and I had very similar instances with other children who came from other countries. And the sad reality of language ideologies is that they could because these children have a particular target in mind and they're not there yet, they start to see English as something that it's out there, not as something that they already have. They're already speaking English, they're already communicating with me. But when they were talking about what English is or what learning English means to them, they kept on saying, I'm not good enough. This is a really powerful example of how language ideologies can develop from a very young age. This is not just, university students learning English and thinking about their identity and who they are as they're learning, or secondary school children, pupils thinking about learning English. That can develop from a very young age. And it has a real impact because they could influence how you feel about yourself, whether you feel that you belong or not, whether you feel you're worthy or not, whether you feel you're capable or not. And that's why it's really important to create a classroom space that is nurturing. And my response, of course, to all those children was that your English is amazing, the way you use it, the way you communicate, and I believe that you actually belong. And we created all sorts of examples and classroom activities, and the teachers were amazing in helping us develop the ethos of nurturing linguistic diversity in the classroom. But this is a really powerful example of how language ideologies can be very impactful in a positive way or a negative way. But I wanted to highlight this example because it comes from young children thinking about, what English means to them or what kind of English they want to develop.
And we as teachers, we face the same problem in classrooms. For example, especially the first week, students, they come, they tell you that, well, my English is not that good. How can I improve myself? But when you see them speaking writing, communicating, they're good. They're maybe, but they have a different, let's say, idea about good English. This is why they think they don't possess it. I don't know. Maybe they don't have that good English that they have in mind. Maybe this is about the ownership of English,
It could be
because
about
they think that the ownership is somewhere else.
that could be a reason. Another reason could be because we all have this Platonic understanding of English. And my colleague Chris Hall talks about Platonic understandings of English, is this idealized imaginings of what English is. So I normally play a game with my students at university. I ask them the following. I say, raise your hand if you think you can speak proper English. And everybody starts looking at, the room around them, just trying to see how many hands have been raised, and not many people raise their hands. Why is that? And most of these learners are learners who identify as, between brackets, native speakers of English. So ownership is an interesting one, yes, but we also need to think about these idealized perceptions of what proper English is. And as I sometimes have a hesitant hand of, yes, I speak proper English. But then I ask people to look around the room and I say, what does this tell us about what English is? And what does this tell us about our own perceptions of idealized English? And I think this little social experiment that I do almost every year, because I really enjoy doing that, is a really interesting experiment about the power of language ideologies.
Yes, exactly. I agree. So what's the teacher's role then? Now, as teachers, we know that English is it's not a one thing. It's not monolithic. Well, we know that there are different varieties. All of them are acceptable. All of them are correct. All of them should receive the same respect. But we as teachers, should we explain this to our students or no? We should, for example, encourage them to develop an academic tone of English.
That's a really good question. It's not an either or, Abdulatif. I think we need both. We need them to develop academic English skills, because this is the language that you and I are using now. This is the language that you and I are using when we write, when we speak, when we teach. And it's really important that we equip them with this language. We know that access to academic English is really important. We know that access to standard English is really important. We know that our students will be judged wherever they go on the basis of how they sound, how they write, how they speak. There are certain perceptions of what it means to be an academic. And these perceptions are manifested linguistically, the way you speak, the way you sound, the way you write. You and I have to speak in a particular way now in this podcast by relying on the academic conventions of having an academic debate. We cannot take this from our students by saying, oh, this is not important. We need a radical vision for language education that decenters the standard. I like to see a radical vision happening, but I don't think that by the risks are too high. And I always say it's not an either or. I think it's really important that we equip our students with all of these different valuable linguistic repertoire, because they are important for their progression in society. But at the same time, we also need to develop sociolinguistic awareness. I believe sociolinguistics as a domain of study and inquiry and thinking about language should be part of every language classroom. And it is through sociolinguistic discussions that the teacher and the students can open their eyes collectively as they puzzle about this thing we call language. So I'm going to tell you a story. Before I came to the UK, I used to work in Palestine. And I used to speak in a very strong American accent back then. You know, all the CDs that we had, all the cassettes at the time, all of them were in American English. So my English at the time was very different. It was very American. And American English in most countries in the Middle East is seen as the target. You know, it's a very prestigious variety.
Yeah.
And there are so many political dimensions to why American English is seen as the prestigious variety.
Yeah.
After that, I came to the UK and I had to change the way I speak. You know, again, it's a question about identity. And I never thought of who I was as a speaker of American English. I never thought about this. It never occurred to me as something relevant or as something that I need to think about. And then gradually the way I spoke changed. I came back to teach in Palestine, and ironically, the first module I had to teach was English pronunciation.
Oh, okay.
So I walked into the classroom with my English pronunciation textbook, you know, to teach the phonetic symbols and how to pronounce the words. My students were first-year undergrad students. It was a large cohort, nearly 200 students.
Oh.
And they all wanted to speak American English, you know, just like how I was.
You just left it, yeah.
And they had this pronunciation lecturer who spoke to them in what they labeled as British English. And every time I pronounced a certain sound, because we had to do the phonetic symbols, they would insist in pronouncing it differently. So the class was so full of tensions, you know, they wanted to sound different they wanted to speak in a certain way. I wanted them to speak in a certain way, and it didn't work. So it's like, okay, guys, we're going to stop the phonetic symbols now, and we're going to talk about world Englishes for the next 5 weeks. And seriously, Abdul Latif, that was probably one of the bravest decisions that I had in my early days as an English lecturer. I decided that I'm not talking about phonetic symbols because, you know what, we need to talk about English in the world before we start talking about phonetic symbols and pronunciation, how to transcribe, etc.
Yeah.
And that was life-changing for me and for my students. I think for the first time, we started asking very basic questions such as, what is English? Who speaks it? What do you know about it? Who do you want to sound as an English speaker? Is there such a thing called Palestinian English? Why not? You know, they resisted it. They were like, what? Palestinian English? That's nonsense. No, there's British English, there's American English. And we had these amazing debates. We talked about identity. We talked about, the galaxy of linguistic diversity. We talked about how we use English as a lingua franca. We talked about situations where standard English might not be desirable, or situations where standard English is actually needed.
Yes.
And over the course of 5 weeks of debating that, I think that's why many of my students, you know, I'm still in touch with them after more than, 12, 15 years through Facebook, etc. They still see me as somebody who had transformed their thinking about English, because they've never had the opportunity to think about these questions. Why would they? I was like them. And for me, English was what? A school subject like maths or science.
Yeah.
So I think this is to answer your question. We need a sociolinguistic discussion and understanding. I think my concern is that most teachers do not have that sociolinguistic awareness. That's why we need to revisit what English language teacher education entails in the 21st century.
Exactly, yes.
And we should not involve in that discussion around, we need to ban standard English or ban academic registers in order to open up everything else. I don't think indulging in an either or scenario is going to fix the coloniality of language, if you like. I think our job as educators is to open up what language is and open up what language can do. And often when I talk about opening up, I always use the and. That's how you open up. And then you leave it to your learners. They are capable of choosing for themselves, because the decisions they make are going to be part of the identity they develop as they learn this new language.
Yes. There's something that you said about your students resisting Palestinian English. We have the same thing. I don't want to say problem, but they have the same thing here in Kuwait. A lot of people, teachers, Kuwaiti English teachers, they resist this idea.
Mm.
For example, they also preferred American British English. When you talk to them about what type of British English, what kind of American English you're talking about, they just refer to the standard, the Queen's English or the standard American English. So why this resistance?
Um, Language has a colonial dimension to it, particularly when we talk about language like English.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what is referred to in the literature as the coloniality of English. So coloniality doesn't just mean the spread and the scope of where English is spoken around the world, but coloniality is also linked to how our minds are colonized by what English is and what proper English is and what authentic English is.
Yeah.
Now, lots of learners have certain desires for what kind of English they want to embody. Most of these desires have colonial roots or elitist roots. Our role as English language educators is to explain the colonial and elitist roots of these desires.
Yeah.
We, as I said earlier, we shouldn't make decisions for learner. You will have learners who will say, I don't want to speak Kuwaiti English, and that's fine. Remember, this is an ideological question, and that's an identity choice.
Yeah.
That this or an
But is this
identity
where
decision.
but is this where the teacher becomes an educator when they educate students about English, not only
Yes.
teach them how to use the language?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So ethical education is about, and I find the work of colleagues like Muth and Len really important here, because they talk about the notion of desiring English, and they talk about the idea of ethical education. And I really agree with their position that if ethical education is about highlighting the colonial, sexist, elitist roots of these desires that students have and associate with English, our job is not to make these decisions, but to raise awareness about these decisions. It's really difficult, Abdulatif. You're asking somebody to embody a variety like Kuwaiti English, knowing that if they speak Kuwaiti English, they will not be seen favorably. Yeah, so it's a big ask that we're having of our learners here, and I think we also need to understand that. Particularly if you don't speak Kuwaiti English, particularly if you have the privileged access to something that can be labeled as British English or American English. We should not underestimate the big ask that we are expecting of our learners. That's why when they resist Kuwaiti English, it's well, remember when I said to you, ideologies not only influence how we speak, but they also influence the judgments we make. So fine, if you have people who resist the idea of Kuwaiti English and they don't want to speak it, that's fine. What is not fine is using their linguistic prejudice to start discriminating against those who speak Kuwaiti English. And I think this is where ethical English language education plays a key role here. Identity questions, identity decisions are left for people. We need to explain the roots of these decisions and the implications of these decisions and let them fly with it. But we also need to think about the danger of language and how language can be used and abused
Exactly.
in discriminatory ways based on the judgments we make.
That's very, very, very important. Yes, I totally agree with you. But the problem is that, okay, now we talked about how teachers might perceive the listeners or those who will interact with Kuwaiti English might perceive Kuwaiti English. So they need to be aware too, not only teachers. So it's on a bigger scale, it will take a lot of time. But hopefully with this podcast, our teachers can start educating, let's say, educating their students about English and how it works in the real world. Okay, so in your experience as a TESOL lecturer, do you have any strategies that you find effective in challenging and deconstructing, I don't want to say harmful ideologies now, but let's say undesired, maybe,
Hmm. Hmm.
language ideologies in the classroom?
I normally start, well, the short answer is sociolinguistic awareness. I think
Mm,
that's key to deconstructing and challenging harmful ideologies. Um, I often start every module I teach by very basic questions. What is language?
mm,
Where is it located? Where does knowledge about language come from? So I ask
mm,
my students these three questions, and we spend normally 2 hours discussing these questions. And these 2 hours open up the understanding of language.
yeah.
And when we try to answer the third question in particular, where does knowledge about language come from? That's when we start to realize that most of the knowledge that we have about language comes from prescriptivist sources, the grammar
Mm,
books that we
yeah.
study or the textbooks about language teaching.
Yes.
And that's when I start to say, okay, can you think about other sources of knowledge that we can
Mm,
use to understand language around us? And
mm,
that's when we start to open up what language might mean and what language knowledge might include. So
yes.
I think that's really important. But then I teach explicitly about language and social justice. And I think this is important that all of us understand and discuss. So we're not just talking about language ideologies, but we're also thinking about language and social justice more broadly.
Mm,
How language privileges and harms certain people in society.
yeah.
And we're talking here about all sorts of people. We're talking about young people. The young can be,
Mm,
in my recent work, I call it children's sociolinguistics. It's a
mm,
work that calls for liberating language from the adult gaze. Because if you
mm,
look at how we do English language education in relation to children, we don't
mm,
give children the needed acknowledgement for all the linguistic creativity that they develop, because
mm.
we don't see this as linguistic creativity. We see it as they're not speaking like us and we need to make them
Yes.
like us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's
Yeah.
that's a colonial way of thinking about language. So this is
Mm,
an example of language and social justice.
mm,
How do we look at linguistic creativity? How can we reimagine linguistic creativity as a resource rather than as something that we need to tame or
mm,
restrict because we want everybody to speak like us.
mm,
So I think we need to have a big paradigm shift in relation to how English language teacher education is done
mm.
in order to unpack all of these complexities with language. And I'm hoping that, people who are listening to this podcast would find this really useful. And I also hope that employers might have an interest in this because employers have
Mm,
a major role in reproducing language ideologies. Whenever you
yeah.
look at job advertisements that
Mm,
advertise for certain speakers of English, that normally stems from either ignorance, somebody who's completely ignorant to the lived reality of English in the world,
mm.
or they could stem from a colonial understanding of what English is.
Yes.
So I often say, even though English looks like the business of teachers and learners, it's actually the business of everybody
Mm,
because English is involved in everything you do in your life, including shops and the way you project yourself professionally. And we need to have a serious discussion, not just within education, within schools and academia, but
mm.
also outside all of these domains, because English continues, not just
Yeah.
English, language more broadly, language
Yeah.
continues to be really relevant to them.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. So if anyone wants to know more about language ideologies, how, like where they come from, how they can, let's say, deconstruct them, challenge them, what to do in the classroom in terms of language ideologies, are there any resources that you recommend? Books, videos?
Um, there are there are lots of books and resources on language ideologies, and I think any basic introductory books to sociolinguistics would cover these areas. I am too humble to promote my book, Language in a Globalized World, which I wrote it with the intention of making it as accessible as possible to a non-linguistic audience. But that is also a good reference if people would like to know more about language and language ideologies. I think there are all sorts of useful resources there, Abdulatif, and I'm really pleased we're talking about this. And I don't think your listeners would be stuck finding resources for language ideologies. It's not a question of reading as much as it's a question of reflection, I think. Reading alone is not enough. You'll find people reading all sorts of things unless you internalize that reading and reflect on what this reading might mean for your professional practice.
Yes.
Nothing tangible will change. And you realize, I say this to my students all the time, you realize that you might be lonely in this endeavor. You realize that you are swimming upstream and that all the teachers in the staff room disagree with you and that your students are not happy with the way you're doing English language education. That doesn't mean that that you are on the wrong. It means that there's so many linguistic battles and so many dominant language ideologies that are relevant in your context. Take it easily. I think that's my advice to everybody who might feel like that. Take it easy and try to identify allies. Try to identify people who think in a certain way or who might be willing to consider joining forces with you and teaching in a certain way. And these allies do not have to be in the same school or the same university. They could be scattered in different parts of the world. I mean, thanks to online communication, now you can create all sorts of groups online and create your own community practice where you might feel less lonely. But the warning here is this is not easy work.
Of course.
Because, unlearning, and I really like the work of my colleague Alison Phipps. She talks a lot about the idea of unlearning, and she reminds us that unlearning habits of oppression, including linguistic oppression and the coloniality of language, unlearning habits of oppression is not easy or neat or straightforward. And many of you listening to our discussion today might feel quite intimidated by this. And this is probably to reassure you that you are not alone in feeling intimidated by this. And that's how I started as a lecturer myself. I felt, and I talk about it in my book, particularly in the chapter where I talk about teaching using a pedagogy of vulnerability. I talk a lot about my vulnerability as a teacher. Talking about language and what language means and what language entails and the use and abuse of language, it could make you feel vulnerable as a teacher sometimes. And I talk about this vulnerability, part of it could be a personal vulnerability, another part of it could be, I don't know, collective vulnerability. I remember looking at the faces of my students and all of us looked equally miserable. That's the collective vulnerability.
Yes.
And sometimes you could find disciplinary vulnerability where your own discipline is rendering you vulnerable or where your own discipline is vulnerable to all that opening up. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the vulnerability that we will encounter. I like to describe that vulnerability as something productive because it is this vulnerability that will allow us to do something different.
Yes, I totally agree. And it takes a lot of courage just to, as you said, the department, you're the only one who has completely different views about language and language education and language use.
No, absolutely.
And I told you before, I've been there, so I know what you're talking about. So, Dr. Khawla Badwan, thank you so much for this episode. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that our listeners will learn a lot from you. And see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Abdulatif. It's been an absolute pleasure.